Hello, and now I wanted to continue with John Dewey and William James for a little while and look at the differences, starting really with the general characteristic of process and pragmatism and its rejection of foundationalism and past empirical philosophies with regards to Locke, of course. Um, but yeah, the rejection of foundationalism is really it's the countering for that is the primacy of concrete experience, as you see them discuss. And so the primacy of concrete experience is a more of a interwoven natural philosophy as opposed to the abstract isolated stoved rooftop with Descartes, for example. Um, and so, yeah, the interwoven process of, there's no event just in a singular atomistic sort of way. It's a interrelated um, way of explaining experience as opposed to some abstract model. For William James, he actually has something called of radical empiricism, where he discusses the consequences of concrete experience. What are your models actually able to demonstrate if they're successful or if there are consequences for your beliefs? That's really William James saying that Locke, in the way he has his theory of experience, isn't radical enough for that empirical sort of methodology, if you will. You see with modern science that we talked about in the last video. Um, so for William James, there's no real discussion of metaphysics that don't have consequences, whether or not you're thinking about them. Things like total knowledge isn't absolute certainty, of course. That isn't really interesting to the pragmatics here. And so William James in his psychology, as we talked about in the last video, is forced concrete experience that we have to take into our own lives. And so we have to make decisions based off of the portion evidence. He's harking back to Locke and trying to build upon it with his psychology. And so the consequence of beliefs are him really saying, though, as well with psychology, that there are certain beliefs that are so spontaneous that we can't really just rationalize them in the sort of way Locke would have seen fit. Sometimes there's just action and direct response towards it, and of course there is the famous line for any evidential philosophy in general, which is, your evidence isn't good enough to support that we need evidence. That's the classic line. And so, another thing that I think is interesting is with William James with regards to the psychological differences in that tradition of, the American public being able to kind of armchair psychology everyone around them and their political enemies and whatnot. You can definitely see that in the works here towards the way we as a people kind of see the world in instrumentation and this pragmatist philosophy. And you can see through William James, it goes back towards political views with case selection and predictive capabilities of what makes liberals and conservatives. I think Strauss has pieces on generational archetypes with events with warfare and whatnot. So there's a long history of using psychology towards, philosophy and political philosophy that could be drawn here. And so, one of the things, of course, that is very important for this method is finding a natural common denominator, or the kind of generic human experience outside of these idiosyncratic and cultural factors. If you want to give it evidentialist, kind of universal claims or something like that, you would want to find a common denominator towards human experience, as opposed to just cultural beliefs or stigmas or something like that. And that's another thing to watch out for in these thinkers. But we're going to put James down now and look at John Dewey. So John Dewey is, of course, a naturalist philosopher. Dewey is using that tradition that is forming with Darwinism. He's the latest thinker we've gotten to so far. He lives all the way to the 50s, I think. So he's very interested, of course, in Darwin and indebted to him in a lot of ways. And so if we're going to look at how Dewey explains experience, Dewey, of course, is in line with Whitehead and James, and that psychology and cognition, if you will, as opposed to Locke's passive experience. There's the emotional experience and cultural experience coming together in a sort of synthesized way, as opposed to just abstraction off alone, not in history and the tabula rasa, if you will. And one of his famous terminology, if you will, is his description of fluid experience. So fluid experience is important for Dewey because it's this sort of constant flowing process, this sort of mode of normality, if you will, where everything is kind of just as is. There's nothing, I can look out my window right now on this summer afternoon and, the birds are chirping. Everything's in motion. I don't really have to think about any sort of issues with the harmony outside my window right now. But that's an example of fluid experience, whereas, as you'll see with his description of problem situations, that's when I have to think. There's a neighbor who needs something. They come up to my door. They ring my doorbell. That's a problem situation. I have to address it. I have to start thinking, what could they need? Something like that. So problem situations are the wrestling of thought, and the intellect takes its role as its resolution of the disruption of fluid experience that demands thought to come up to begin with, to think experimentally for a problem that arose that disrupted fluid experience. You can see the Hegelian tradition here with the thesis of everything coming along naturally in that fluid process, and the antithesis of a problem situation arising, and then you get the synthesis of the solution returns back towards that process of fluid experience once you apply your experimental thoughts towards the problem situation. So experience or growth is an evolutionary process where you incorporate, past problem situations onto, the progression of yourself, those decisions and factors in your environment and how it interacts with you. This is how you end up with something like kind of functional psychology. And so for Dewey, you can perhaps see with regards to his naturalist philosophy that there's no fixed species because everything's in a kind of growth process. And so, he takes on the Aristotelian tradition of, fixed essences or forms. there is no universals for Dewey. There's nothing intrinsic, there's no fixed ends to pursue, or fixed laws of thought. Intellect is a tool of adjustment. It's always constantly changing in the process of environmental factors and the naturalist relationships, as it were. So there is no universals for John Dewey, and the intellect is a tool made to accommodate that interaction. And experimental thinking is the application of the scientific method to everything. That's his epistemology, if you will. And it's a description of the natural environment of practical demands of concrete experience. How does inquiry operate with regards to natural selection? And there's another interesting terminology with regards to operationalist thinking, which is the proposal for problems, and how do we operate those hypotheticals. This is, of course, interesting for anyone into political theory, and the American public kind of, once again, I think, shows that tradition of our thinking, especially perhaps with regards to, the right, as it were, with, what is, how are we going to actually do these operational ideas? How can we make these experimentation actually come to concrete experience? We think all the time of the classic arguments about welfarism and whatnot as the left offers up these different solutions, and you have the American conservative who says, well, what is this going to actually go in operation? Where are you going to get the tax dollars? That conversation's been going on for a millennium now, it seems. But you can see that here again with the pragmatist fathers here, with that kind of being ingrained in the American psyche, and I think it's indebted with that here. But anyway, as it regards to applied science, which is really, what are we able to do with scientific theory? It's not, the nature of reality. We can't really know that, but we can know, what works and what doesn't with its instrumentation through operationalism. So, understanding the fundamentals of reality, we can leave that to, someone who likes to sit in a stove-heated room and question their own existence during the French winter. But, you don't need to have the fundamentals of reality if you can find applied knowledge towards environmental situations, and being able to model experimental thinking and really producing the results or the consequences for William James out of that, whether good or bad. And you can see, as for his ethics, which I've kind of laid out for you here, is instrumentation. Dewey's values emerge out of problem situations. It's not, what human beings are thinking about, when they're laying in bed about being a good person, but what they actually do in situations when the intellect is required. That is where ethics really, that's where you get to the nitty-gritty, if it were. And so if you have an instrumental ethics in problem situations that are personalized, then each situation has a unique and satisfying experience. And so if you look at Dewey's piece on democracy and education, you can see, at least intended in the American education system, if it were, it's supposed to have that sort of individual way of answering problem situations for that individual student in their way of life at that time, is what education is for Dewey, instead of this long history and tradition of syllogisms or forms and their theory in an abstract sense. How are your students actually doing in concrete experience in their day-to-day lives in a complex society? That's what Dewey's trying to get at with his education, or his idea of it. And so you can see his contemplation for the praxis of action towards an education and its personalization. And you can see, when American education was at the forefront, 200 years ago or something like that now, or even 100, you could say, in some places. You can see that, there's that hybridization of, classic values and classic education. We clearly learn from our Greeks and Romans. It's, the backbone of our civilization, if you will, or its foundations. But you can also see that, there's that pragmatist, that instrumentation of what about, applied sciences, if it were, in today's world. And you can see really with most people who are into the sciences, if you ever talk to, or if you had a university education and you talk to people in STEM or something like that, understanding science isn't about understanding necessarily reality as a whole or having absolute certainty. It's about the functions of what these models can actually produce for the utility of its people. And you can see that tradition here, of course. And so for Dewey, if we were going to talk then about religion and talking about classic values, religion for Dewey is it's not static ideals, but tools for life adjustment. If we're going to take the etymology, if you will, for religion, and it's tying together, retying or reorientating, reincorporating a people together. So Dewey's not interested, of course, in a one true religion or which religion is the truth, but it's the instrumentation of how it reties communities and creates civilizations, and how it can obviously bring a community together. And once again, you can see in the American public, if we're going to be cynical for a second, are Americans really true and honest Christians most of the time compared to even other countries in today's world? That's questionable, certainly. So I think it's kind of interesting to see with metaphysics and religious discussion is really just brought down to whether or not it's useful in its instruments for community. And so the pursuit of ideals of community is God, and it serves as Dewey's denominator for all historical religions. So he examines attitudes instead of truth. And you can see with his regards to human rights and that sort of doctrine, the Humanist Manifesto for rights is that man emerges as a gradual process out of the environmental factors of being in the universe. And you can see here with the ideas of secular humanism, which is, I think, really, at least in today's world, more in line with the Western thought right now, whether or not we want to say that's a good thing. But you definitely see this sort of secular humanist, naturalistic human rights. God is just this symbolic of man, as opposed to actually being truthful or actually believing in these stories. It's just the symbolics of whether or not the story is actually useful for a community. So once you look at all this terminology and see really the influence of modern applied sciences towards the modern world as a whole, really. You can wrap your head around Dewey with instrumental ethics, radical empiricism with William James, and seeing what they're getting at with regards to the development of natural biology and evolutionary thinking, as well as the incorporation of the social theory of mind starting to emerge really in philosophy and cognition, and understanding it and recognizing it, and really the professionalization and as it goes with the separating of the disciplines. I talked about, in the last video, about William James having a philosophy seat at forgot what university it was, but he was ultimately a psychologist. He really didn't follow philosophy all that much. He was more interested in these discussions on psychology, and he was recognized, of course, and you'd see with journals at the time, at the turn of the century, science, philosophy, and psychology were coupled all together, but you can see that's going to start falling apart here as you get to the specialization of all these different fields. But yeah, that's what John Dewey and the pragmatists as a large look to do with, before we go on to look at Dewey's reconstructive philosophy. And I also might have a special post to put out in the meantime. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this outline for John Dewey, and see you guys for the next one. Hope you guys subscribe and comment and like this video.